Imagine being surrounded by dark waters, injured, exhausted, and then realizing that something is lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. Throughout history, some encounters between humans and sharks have turned into true nightmares. Follow along below. Sailors on a secret mission are attacked and left adrift, surrounded by countless sharks. One of the greatest carnages ever recorded. A brutal story of survival, fear, and sacrifice on the high seas. A sinking turns the ocean into a deadly hunting ground, where hundreds are devoured by sharks. One of the most terrifying episodes in history. Several people are attacked on the New Jersey coast, spreading terror and generating such a huge social impact that it inspired films and shaped society. Way in which sharks are still seen today. On July 30th, 1945, a heavy cruiser sank in the Pacific Ocean, leading to one of the deadliest shipwrecks in history. The USS Indianapolis was built in Camden, New Jersey, and launched in 1931, joining the United States Navy the following year. This Portland-class cruiser was 186 meters long and weighed 9,950 tons. Its primary armament included 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. The ship was powered by 8 boilers feeding 4 steam turbines, allowing it to reach speeds of over 32 knots, approximately 50 kilometers per hour. The Indianapolis operated in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. After the United States entered World War II, the ship was assigned to carrier task forces in the Pacific. In 1943, it became the flagship of the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. The Indianapolis took part in the bombardment of the Japanese island of Iwo Jima in February 1945. The following month, it was damaged by a kamikaze aircraft near the island of Okinawa, but was quickly repaired and returned to active service. At the end of July 1945, the Indianapolis was sent on a high-speed mission to deliver a cargo to a U.S. airbase on Tinian, one of the Mariana Islands in the Western Pacific. However, this was an ultra-secret mission, so secret that only a few high-ranking officials on the ship and within the government knew its true purpose. The ship's hold was loaded with components for the first atomic bomb, Little Boy. Also on board was the projectile of enriched uranium for the bomb, stored inside a lead-lined steel container, which was bolted and chained to the floor of Captain Charles McVeigh's quarters. On July 16th, the Indianapolis departed from Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. During its journey, it set a speed record, covering the distance to Pearl Harbor in just 75.5 hours, averaging 29 knots, 54 kilometers per hour. After arriving at Pearl Harbor on July 19th, the cruiser continued alone to Tinian, where it delivered the atomic bomb components on July 26th. That same day, the remaining 25 kilograms of enriched uranium, destined for the bomb's target piece, were divided into 3 parts and transported separately in 3 C-54 cargo planes from Albuquerque, New Mexico, arriving in Tinian on July 29th. The following day, assembly of the atomic bomb began, leading to its deployment over Hiroshima on August 6th. Before the launch, ground crew signed and wrote messages on the weapon. One of them read, "Greetings to the Emperor from the men of Indianapolis." After its stop in Tinian, the Indianapolis continued its route to Guam, where several crew members who had completed their missions were replaced by new sailors. Leaving Guam, the ship began sailing toward Leyte in the Philippines, where its crew was to undergo training before heading to Okinawa to join Vice Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's Task Force 95. However, what seemed like a well-planned journey took a devastating turn. On July 30th, 1945, shortly after midnight, the Indianapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes from a Japanese submarine, one hitting the bow and the other midship. The attack was carried out by Japanese commander and Captain Makitsura Hashimoto. The explosions caused massive destruction. For 12 minutes, the men fought to escape the fire and the lower decks. Many didn't make it. Then, the stern of the Indianapolis rose into the air before the ship sank. Around 300 of the 1,195 crew members on board were dragged to the depths along with the ship. With few lifeboats and life vests, the remaining crew was left adrift in the open ocean. That night, some men suffered minor injuries, while others were severely wounded by the explosions. All struggled to stay afloat in the darkness and cold. Many were just 18 or 19 years old, but despite their youth, they did their best to remain calm. Several crew members formed groups for mutual protection as the night wore on. When the sun rose, more people had died and sunk, while others, already lifeless, floated thanks to their life vests. A headcount was conducted, revealing just over 800 survivors. As the first day progressed, the living searched for the dead, taking their life vests to increase their own chances of survival. In an attempt to maintain some semblance of order, the sailors gathered into larger groups. Young men, overwhelmed by thirst, drank the salt water and became gravely ill. Although many species of sharks inhabit the open waters of the Pacific, few are as aggressive toward humans as the oceanic whitetip. These sharks were drawn by the sounds of the explosions, the sinking of the ship, the commotion, and the blood in the water, quickly turning the survivors into prey. Every so often, like a lightning strike, one of them would charge in, grab a sailor, and drag him below. At first, the sharks focused on the floating dead, but the struggling survivors in the water only attracted more of them. By the second day, the sharks had turned their attention to the living, forcing the survivors to seek safety in numbers. They realized that their chances of survival were greater in a group, as those who drifted alone were the most vulnerable to attacks. When someone died, the remaining sailors pushed the body away, hoping to sacrifice the corpse in exchange for a brief reprieve from the shark's jaws. Many were paralyzed by fear, unable to eat or drink from the scarce rations they had salvaged from the ship. One group of survivors made the mistake of opening a can of food, but before they could take a bite, the scent of meat attracted a swarm of sharks. The sailors quickly discarded their meat rations rather than risk a second group attack. By the third day, any hope of rescue seemed to fade. The men of the Indianapolis were dehydrated, starving, some wounded, and all consumed by fear. Although U.S. Navy intelligence had intercepted a message from the Japanese submarine that had torpedoed the Indianapolis, officials dismissed it as a possible trap meant to lure rescue ships into an ambush. Hundreds of survivors succumbed to the heat and thirst or suffered hallucinations that drove them to drink seawater, a death sentence by salt poisoning. Those who quenched their thirst fell into a state of delirium, foaming at the mouth as their tongues and lips swelled. Often, they became as great a threat as the sharks circling below. Many dragged their comrades underwater with them as they died. By then, many of the men had begun to lose faith that they would ever be rescued. On the fourth day, August 2nd, at around 11 a.m., something that could only be described as miraculous happened. A U.S. Navy plane flew over the survivors and spotted them. Shocked by what he saw, pilot Adrian Marks radioed for help and, within hours, returned with a seaplane. He flew as close to the water as possible, dropping life rafts and survival supplies. When Marks saw men being attacked by sharks, he disobeyed orders and landed in the shark-infested waters, taxiing his plane to rescue the wounded and those who were falling behind, the ones most at risk. Shortly after midnight on August 3rd, the USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived and rescued the last survivors from the water. Of the original 1,196 crew members, only 316 remained. Although sharks loom large in the ship's tragic history, most sailors died from exposure, lack of food and water, injuries from the explosion, exhaustion, and other causes. After the rescue, the Navy court-martialed the captain of the Indianapolis, Charles B. McVay, for failing to save his ship. Eager to place the blame on McVay rather than acknowledge the series of mistakes that led to the disaster, authorities pursued his conviction. Not only had the Navy denied the Indianapolis an escort, but it also failed to inform the captain that he was sailing directly into the path of an enemy submarine. When the Indianapolis failed to reach its destination, no one reported it missing. It was only by chance that a passing plane spotted the surviving sailors. McVay's conviction effectively ended his Navy career, and he died by suicide in 1968, allegedly while holding a toy sailor. It wasn't until 2001 that the Navy exonerated McVay, adding a congressional resolution to clear his name in his official record. Today, the sinking of the Indianapolis is remembered as one of the deadliest naval disasters in American history. On November 28, 1942, during World War II, the Nova Scotia was transporting Italian prisoners of war, crew members, and Allied soldiers while facing the Axis forces, composed of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Nova Scotia was a British merchant ship, built in the early 20th century to carry cargo and passengers. It was part of the fleet operated by Clan Line, a British shipping company specializing in maritime trade between Europe and the colonies of the British Empire. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, the Nova Scotia continued operating as a civilian vessel. On September 21, 1940, it departed from Liverpool to Canada, carrying passengers, including 29 British children evacuated under the Children's Overseas Reception Board program. This program relocated children to safer places outside Britain, but was soon discontinued after a German submarine attacked and sank the city of Benares, a ship operated by Elliman Lines, resulting in a tragic loss of life, including many children. In early 1941, the Ministry of War Transport requisitioned the Nova Scotia to serve as a troop transport vessel. On February 3rd, it embarked 1,200 soldiers and departed with a convoy from Britain to Freetown, Sierra Leone, where it arrived on March 2nd. It then headed south, crossing the equator on March 12th, and reached Cape Town, South Africa, on March 22nd. In the fall of 1942, the Nova Scotia departed Port Talfik in Egypt, sailing across the Red Sea to Massawa in Eritrea, then under British occupation. There, it disembarked American troops and boarded Italian prisoners of war. Before continuing its journey, the ship made a stop in the British colony of Aden. Without military escort, it set course southward, carrying more than 750 Italian prisoners of war, interned civilians, and 3,000 bags of mail, bound for Durban, South Africa. As the war progressed, the Nova Scotia continued to be requisitioned for military transport. However, its conversion for war purposes also made it a target for enemy submarines. Its construction adhered to the common standards of the time, with a reinforced steel hull designed to withstand long ocean voyages, but lacking significant military defenses. This made the ship vulnerable. On the morning of November 28, 1942, around 7:15 a.m., the Nova Scotia was sailing off the coast of Natal Province in South Africa, after crossing the Mozambique Channel, when it was struck by 3 torpedoes fired by the German submarine U-177. The impact caused the ship to list to port, catch fire, and sink by the bow in just 10 minutes. The crew managed to launch only 1 lifeboat, leaving many survivors adrift on makeshift rafts or wreckage. However, most of those who remained in the water eventually drowned or were attacked by sharks. The Germans aimed to sink the Nova Scotia, but they were unsure of its cargo. The U-177, commanded by Robert Gise, spotted the ship, and as Nazi Germany was at war with the United Kingdom and its allies, any British ship was considered a legitimate military target. Suspecting the Nova Scotia was a troop transport vessel, the Germans pursued and attacked. The U-177 fired 3 torpedoes, which struck the ship and caused it to sink rapidly. However, the Germans were unaware that Italian prisoners of war were aboard. They only discovered this after rescuing 2 survivors to identify the ship. When they realized they had killed hundreds of their own Italian allies, they were shocked. Even though Italy was their ally, Gise decided not to rescue anyone else and ordered the submarine to withdraw from the area. However, Gise reported the incident to the German Submarine High Command, which in turn requested help from Portugal, a neutral country in the war. In response to the request, Portugal sent the frigate NRP Afonso to Albuquerque, departing from Lourenço Marques, now Maputo, Mozambique, to conduct rescue operations. The passengers and crew of the Nova Scotia were in the water for just over a day before the frigate arrived and began the rescues on November 29th. The crew of the frigate was met with a devastating scene, surrounded by hundreds of floating corpses in the sea. Despite the tragedy, they managed to save 194 people, including 130 Italian prisoners of war, 42 guards, 17 crew members, 3 soldiers, 2 sailors, and 2 passengers. In total, 858 people died in the sinking, including 650 Italian prisoners of war, 96 crew members, 88 South African guards, 10 gunners, 8 soldiers and sailors, 5 passengers, and the ship's master. In addition to those rescued by the frigate, 2 more survivors managed to escape. One was found on the 3rd day after the attack, while the other remained adrift in a lifeboat for 15 days until reaching the coast of Mtanzini, South Africa. Many of the bodies of the victims from the shipwreck were carried by the sea to the coast of Natal in South Africa. The remains of 120 Italian prisoners of war and civilians were buried in a mass grave in the suburb of Hillary in Durban, forming the core of what would later become the Italian military cemetery. Subsequently, in 2008, the bodies were transferred to the cemetery of the Italian church in Pietermaritzburg. The sinking of the Nova Scotia on November 28th remains one of the worst shipwrecks in history involving shark attacks and one of the greatest maritime tragedies of World War II in the Indian Ocean. On Saturday, July 1, 1916, in New Jersey, USA, Charles Epting Van Sant, 23, was on vacation with his family. They were staying at the Ingleside Hotel in Beach Haven, a community on Long Beach Island, in the southern part of New Jersey, enjoying the summer. Around 6 p.m., Charles decided to take a swim at a nearby beach, bringing his dog along. He swam about 100 meters and, feeling satisfied, was preparing to head back when suddenly he began shouting for help. At that moment, Van Sant was about 15 meters from the shore, and other beachgoers couldn't understand what he was trying to say. While a shark was devouring his legs, people assumed he was merely calling his dog. As the water turned red with his blood, Alexander Ott, a lifeguard and former member of the American swimming team, appeared. He was joined by Sheridan Taylor, a swimmer, who both rushed to help. The 2 men managed to pull Charles from the water and carried him back to the hotel. His left thigh had been severely mauled. He bled to death, but the attack didn't create much of a stir in the press, and the beaches along the Jersey coast remained open. The news of the day was dominated by the polio epidemic that was ravaging New York. At the time, most people didn't believe a man could be killed by a shark. Even scientists dismissed the incident as a strange accident that was unlikely to happen again. On July 6, 1916, in Spring Lake, about 72 kilometers north of Beach Haven, Charles Bruder, 27, was enjoying a free afternoon with a quick swim. Everything seemed fine, but when he was about 120 meters from the shore, he was attacked by a shark. A woman who witnessed the scene ran to a lifeguard and told him that a red canoe had overturned and was floating. Firefighters Chris Anderson and George White immediately boarded a boat and headed towards the location. Upon arriving, they realized it wasn't an overturned red canoe, but a man covered in blood. When they pulled the victim onto the boat, Chris and George noticed an unusual lightness. He was missing both of his legs. One version of the story says that, as soon as they looked at Bruder's injuries, they concluded it was the work of a shark. Another version states that the young man was still alive when he was placed in the boat and regained consciousness, likely after CPR. According to this version, his last words were that a shark had bitten him. Bruder died before reaching land. This second attack received more media coverage, and local authorities implemented protective measures. The attack occurred just 5 days after the first one, on July 12th, in Matawan, 48 kilometers north of Spring Lake and still along the New Jersey coast. The news of the 2 shark attacks was being discussed by the locals. However, they felt reassured by the distance between them. Aside from the distance, most of them preferred swimming in streams rather than on beaches. And although the streams were connected to the ocean, they couldn't fathom how a shark could make its way into one. That morning, while crossing a bridge over a creek, fisherman Thomas Cottrell spotted the silhouette of a huge shark. Frightened, the man immediately notified the police, but he was dismissed. Around 2 p.m. that same day, 11-year-old Lester Stilwell dove into a river in the town. He was swimming with his friends near the Wyckoff dock. One of the boys had brought his pet dog along, and it too was swimming. Suddenly, something yanked Lester to the bottom. Shouts rang out as his head bobbed up and down on the surface. To the horror of his friends, he disappeared into a pool of blood. The boys ran terrified into town to get help. A group of people gathered and headed to the creek. However, these people didn't believe the boy had been attacked by a shark. They thought it must have been something else. Watson Stanley Fisher, a 24-year-old businessman, was part of the group that went to help. He dove into the water to search for the boy, but instead of finding Lester, he encountered the shark. The shark bit into his right leg, tearing off half of it up to his thigh. After being rescued, Fisher was rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, he suffered severe bleeding on the operating table and passed away that night. It was only on July 14th that Lester Stillwell's body was found, less than 1.6 kilometers from where Fisher and Stillwell were attacked. About 30 minutes after Fisher had been taken to the hospital, another attack occurred. A shark grabbed the leg of 14-year-old Joseph Dunn, who was with his brother Michael and friends in a nearby creek. While the shark pulled Joseph away, Michael and Jacob Lefferts, one of the friends, managed to pull him back. Thankfully, the boys succeeded in saving him. Although the shark's teeth caused significant damage to Joseph's leg, the major bones and arteries were unharmed. He was taken to the hospital, where his leg was amputated, but aside from that, he recovered well. As the media heavily covered the events in Beach Haven, Spring Lake, and Matawan, fear began to spread. Major American newspapers, including the Washington Post, placed the stories on the front pages, amplifying the panic. The public's concern grew drastically, with many now fearing the presence of sharks in the waters off the New Jersey coast. The fear was so intense that New Jersey resorts lost numerous clients and a significant amount of money. James Fairman Fielder, the governor of New Jersey, saw a solution in offering rewards to anyone willing to capture the sharks. This marked the beginning of what would later be called the largest animal hunt in history, during which hundreds of sharks were killed. On July 14, 1916, Michael Schleicher achieved the unthinkable. He captured a 7.5-foot shark, 6 kilometers from Raritan Bay, which he identified as a female great white shark. John Treadwell Nichols and Robert Murphy, specialists who examined the shark's body, found its stomach full of bones and human flesh. They deemed it the culprit behind the attacks. However, what appeared to be a conclusive end to the matter only sparked more doubts among the public. At the time, knowledge about sharks was limited, and many people didn't believe the conclusions of Nichols and Murphy. For most, a shark wasn't capable of killing a human, and various theories began to emerge. Nevertheless, the specialists' conclusions prevailed. In 2002, the National Geographic Society questioned whether the great white shark captured by Michael Schleicher was truly responsible for the fatalities. After all, attacks in a river couldn't really be attributed to it, since a great white shark cannot survive in fresh water. Richard Ellis, in his 1976 Book of Sharks, discussed this issue as well. According to Richard Ellis, the theory that only one shark was responsible for the attacks was pure sensationalism. He pointed out several details supporting the presence of multiple species, such as the distance between Beach Haven and Matawan, the fact that the first 2 attacks occur in the ocean while the other 3 took place in a river, and the varying sizes of bite marks on 3 of the victims. Richard Ellis argued that 3 species were involved: the tiger shark, the bull shark, and the great white shark. However, the reason behind the behavior of the attacks remains a mystery. After the terrifying events in New Jersey, public opinion swung to the other extreme. Sharks quickly came to be seen not just as eating machines, but also as fearless and relentless killers. In 1974, writer Peter Benchley published a novel about a great white shark terrorizing the fictional coastal community of Long Island in Amity. The novel was adapted into the film Jaws by Steven Spielberg in 1975. Both the book and the film drew heavily from the 1916 attacks, which have also been the subject of several other books and studies. The attacks along the New Jersey coast were pivotal events that had a significant impact on society. The popularity of both the book and the film forged a strong connection between sharks and fear, a connection that remains to this day.